I'd like to welcome you all to the third roundtable of our roundtable series for this year. So the roundtable today is titled From Knowledge Production to Impact, Research as Environmental Activism. It's prepared in collaboration or partnership with Synapse. And it is part of NCC's 2024 roundtable series called The New Roadmap to a Green Transition, Exploring Today's Climate Actors. So first, to deliver opening remarks, we're lucky to have Dean Faris Dahdah, who's the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Dean Dahdah, before taking his position in 2022, came from Rice University in Houston, Texas, where he was a professor of arts history and co-director of the Museums and Cultural Heritage Program. He has a broad expertise in digital tools, methods, data, and visualization. He served as chair of Rice University's Committee on Information Technology. He also led the Spatial Studies Lab, designing and creating novel online geospatial platforms in the areas of cultural heritage, public health, social justice, and resilience. So before Dean Dahdah starts his presentation, I want to also say a few words about Synapse and Alex, who will be moderating today's panel. Synapse Partners is a think tank, or Alex can use the exact term that they use. They're an organization or a center that partners with local and international charities, development agencies, and private companies grappling with increasingly volatile social, economic, and political realities. Their work comes from the belief that for global resources to trickle down, grounded insights need to flow up. Their work is rooted in data analysis, visualization, and making this data accessible for all. Alex is a co-founder and the director of the Environment Program at Synapse. He leads Synapse research on environmental adaptation in the Middle East and North Africa. He publishes regular analysis on his Substack and provides methodological support to colleagues studying topics across Synapse portfolio, ranging from water and agriculture in Syria to human mobility in Lebanon and Jordan. He's a native of California. He holds a BA from Princeton University and an MA from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So again, thank you to Synapse and thank you to Dean Dahdah for partnering up for today's event. I look forward to your presentation, Dean, and then Alex will take over for the moderation. Thanks again and welcome everyone.
Hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, how does that work?
Now we can't.
Wait, how come you can't?
That was a joke.
Okay, you must. All right, that should work. I need you share it.
This is a PC.
No, it's not a joke.
No, yeah, I'm supposed to do your work, maybe. Okay. Thank you. Can I hide this little window?
Yes. This one.
No, hide. Thank you. All right, here we go. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction. I must confess, when I got the invitation, I was like, why me? Then I thought, actually, I could pull it off, mostly around research infrastructure. So if you want research to have an impact, research infrastructure is a step in between. And so, in order to make a case for necessary research infrastructure that a university such as this one ought to have, I thought I would tell you a story that begins with a project and that led to projects I never thought I'd ever be involved in. So here we go. Okay, not really. Okay, try that. Ali, how do I go forward? Okay, never mind, I figured out. Ali? Okay, how do I go forward? Because none of these work. You know, there is a reason why Mac is around. وشو أشوف بس. Okay.
This one.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
I have to do control too.
No, just this one.
Let's try it. Okay, got it. So, okay, sorry for the, here we go. So I'm going to take you back to a project that was started on a table thing at a cafeteria at Rice University. And this was more than 10 years ago. When a professor of architecture at the time and another in history wanted to situate the iconography of Rio de Janeiro in both time and in space, while accurately depicting a city's urban evolution. More specifically, I'm referring to this moment on a placemat when two faculty members meet at the faculty club and decide to ride the Brasilomania wave that was happening at the time when Brazil was going to host the Olympics, was going to host the World Cup, the economy was booming. So a colleague and I were like, okay, how can we work on Brazil anyway, how can we take advantage to this thing? So why don't we do something really simple? We create a Brazilian studies project for Rice University, Rio de Janeiro, a cityscape through time. It was like as dumb as it can be. The project was called Mapping Rio, and it had stage 1 planning, stage 2 courses, stage 3 symposium, stage 4 exhibition, stage 5 publication. As classic as it can be. And no geodatabase or geo anything at the time. But then in order to teach a course on Rio together, we collected visual material through which we could illustrate Rio's history and on which students could work even if they did not read or Portuguese. So we started collecting images of Rio and putting it in an image repository. That was our first database. So we could it was a particular thing. Anyway, I won't tell you the story of how we got there, but finally the library makes available what was then called Shared Shelf, doesn't exist anymore. Now it's called JSTOR Forum, if anyone's interested. And we created, we customized the metadata schema so that we could do maps, views, plans. We kind of created our own typology of images. And I mean, these are plans, but it was also to be able to represent the history of Rio de Janeiro as it once was, but also as it was once imagined. We then felt the need to situate this material in a temporally accurate environment, and with the help of the university's GIS and data center, we somehow transitioned from what was no more than an image repository to what became an illustrated, geographically informed system. So in the process and under the pressure of a steep learning curve, we managed to get a couple of campus funding opportunity that got us going, and these two initial investments triggered, these were internal to the university, got us going and kept us busy ever since. So you can barely see this. So there were many students, scholars, oh no, you can see this, artists, tech innovators who helped us along the way, particularly students who were part of what was, I don't know if anyone's interested in this, but Brazil at the time, in all its magnificence, had the Science Without Borders program. They were sending 100,000 students every year all over the planet to study. So they came and worked with us. So tons of people worked on this project. And the project became known as Imagine Rio, a data version of what was first imagined on a placemat, i.e. a searchable map that illustrates the urban evolution of a city over its entire history. Not only as it once existed, but also as it has often been imagined. In Imagine Rio, views of the city, historic maps of the city, as well as site plans for projects in the city, are all geolocated in both time and in space. In one form or another, others had tried this before, at least on paper. There were many attempts. I mean, there were others before us had sort of mapped out the evolution of the city in different forms. We thought it would therefore be fairly easy. Like, since others have done it, why don't we just copy? To simply transform these existing and available atlases into a digital platform. There were, however, many problems in making this transition from analog to digital. One of them you're looking at, which means if you actually copy, nothing will ever match because of printing techniques. So if you try to situate that in GIS space with actual coordinates, you'll get approximations. It will not match any reality. So it was simply not enough to transform previous atlases into a digital form. We had to figure out workarounds to solve that problem, because you're looking at the same thing represented in different ways, in different maps. So there were other problems, like beautiful 18th century folios of parts of Rio that came in pieces, but you had no idea how to put them together. So Photoshop can help. So you could sort of reassemble and therefore extract quite precise information about trails and this that existed, or where churches were, and so forth. Now, that's good with a folio of 8 plates or 16 plates, but you can get to 256 plates. And for that, without an index. So you have a folio full of maps, and you're like, okay, which one is next to which one? So we used a visualization wall, one of these giant, and then slowly but surely, using a software that doesn't exist anymore called NIP2, that kind of, you become a Sherlock Holmes, like, aha, this is like this, and this is like that. And then the computer figures it out. Kept on going, 256 plates, not a little. Kept on going and going until you discover that the one plate you really needed to do the history of Rio de Janeiro is actually missing. So while juggling all these difficulties, we created our own GIS environment where everything was drawn against contemporary satellite images, and every feature was given a first display and last display year. In order to reach a good level of accuracy, we had to physically manipulate the very contours of the city's landscape. At this point, we turned to Access Maps, a company, a digital cartography studio, which helped us to get started, and with whom actually we continue to collaborate. And we basically sketched out the project before doing anything. There is something called the project. It's going to have maps, it's going to have views, it's going to have site plans. The maps are historical and contemporary, the site plans are built and unbuilt, the views are watercolors, drawings, photos, etc. Yes, and they all have to kind of feed into the project, which we don't know. So then we decided, well, the project is a digital platform. Somehow all these things have to integrate together so that you could reconstruct the urban and social history of the city. So then this digital platform should have a time slider. You should be able to probe it, click it for information. It will have layers. You should have a search function and also an export function so that people can build their own PowerPoints based on it. The timeline should look something like this. The layers, we came up with the grammar or the syntax, and then, sketched it out. So all these are mock-ups of what the platform will eventually look like. I will go fast. Search, probe. This is probe, sorry. So you can probe something and it will give you information in return. And then you can drill down for more stuff. Search, here it is. And then export. I'm trying to go fast, but and then eventually we would move to user participation and a mobile app. That was all theory. We had no clue how to do any of this. But in order to have this, to make this possible, we needed research infrastructure. So I had to convince the university to give us the virtual machines, to maintain the virtual machines, to give us public-facing IP addresses. All the problems I'm facing now here, I faced then there. But slowly but surely came up with the infrastructure that could sustain such a project. And this infrastructure, or this geostack in IT lingo, consisted of something that looks like this. And you can see over there how it's structured. You have the data, connectors, styling, integration, rendering, storage, and finally the user interface. There's a geodatabase in there. It's actually the brain where all the back-end work happens. It's connected to an image repository. It's connected to storage. It has a brain that integrates everything together. And finally, it has a delivery service, which is the actual interface that the user sees. So I give you version number 1 of Imagine Rio. So you have a time slider. You are now in 1704. Now we have every street name, every important building, who designed it, when it was demolished. So this is when you call up a map. It situates itself over the base map, you call up the historic map. You can also click on geographic features, so marshes in this case, how marshes were in 1704, where the beaches were, or what was called the beach at the time, Raya. Buildings, whether they are religious or military. And you can probe the map for information. So anywhere you click, you get everything around that click. Whether it's a road, a public space, or a building. And if you click on that building, it will highlight on the map. This is a road, the street. You can keep going into closer to the present. And since everything has an early date, last date, start date, end date, things show up as you go in time. Get the picture? Okay. So also for every view, so for every image of Rio that we had, watercolor, photo, etc., we drew a view cone that matches the photograph. Okay, I'll get to nature elsewhere. And then we also showed urban projects that were designed for Rio de Janeiro, but were either never implemented. So these are municipal projects that the city grew into over time.
This is an interesting project. Funding the city.
Oh yeah, this is the new harbor. So, and then the city actually grows into that plan. All right, you basically get the picture. So then in order to make sure that Rice University makes available, because all this to to exist, you need virtual machines in the background running the engine that makes this map possible, because every time you call up something, you probe, there's a computer actually churning images on the fly. So it's not as if we drew everything, we just created a computer or a program, an application that produces what the user is asking right there and then. So for that, you need some computing power, and it has to be hosted somewhere on the cloud, and it has to be sustained by somebody, and for a university willing to support new forms of research, because universities or IT offices in universities are good at supporting high-performance computing, they're good at supporting desktop computing, but all this stuff in between, they don't know quite what to do. So in order to convince Rice, you absolutely need to do this, I did one for the campus. And I did it on a mobile so that you could walk around the campus and see how the evolution of the Rice University campus over time. I'll go quickly. So you can stand at a certain spot, go back in time, and see what you might have seen way back then. What I showed you until now is all done with raster tiles, meaning the computer actually does the rendering and feeds them to your computer. So we decided that we should move into the next step, which are vector tiles, where it's just code. The cloud stores nothing. You just basically so your computer does the rendering. It's no longer on the cloud somewhere. It's far more efficient. It's less costly, and it's more sustainable on the long run, because you can't really have these huge computers churning up drawings by the millions. So we came up with version number 2. Okay, go. Here. So this now is far more fluid. Before you could see the tiles reconstructing, now you see the evolution of the city, because now it's actually your computer doing the rendering and not a machine online somewhere. Okay, I'll skip. So then we presented this at an international cartographic conference in Rio by chance. We met with an institute that has the most amazing photo collection ever on Rio. And they have material like this. So we decided, and they were coincidentally doing the same thing in Photoshop that we were doing computationally. So we joined forces. They had an image repository of photographs. They had a repository of iconography, so not just photos, but watercolors, etc. We got a Getty grant together, and we decided to do a bunch of things that led to version 2. How am I doing on time?
2 minutes.
Oh, okay, so I'll go quickly. So this is version 2. And then it's basically the same exact thing, but now it's using the vector tile method. I'll skip. And we decided here to now create both an album and an atlas at the same time, so that whatever you probe in the photograph, you can probe in the atlas at the same time. And what I mean is that every pixel in a photograph now has longitude, latitude, and elevation, so that anytime you click anything on a photograph, it's connected to geographic material. So if I click on this guy here, it should show up there. And these things should match. And that way we could now integrate almanac information. I'm going to skip. So this is the latest version. Doesn't matter. I'm not here to talk about Imagine Rio, but what I want to show is this, that now the geostack is far more complicated in order to do what I just described. And eventually it would go into a 3D version of the same thing. So, and it was eventually shown at the Venice Biennale, but that's fine. So then catastrophes started happening. Harvey, if you remember, Hurricane Harvey in Houston, where over 3 days, come on, this is what happened to the city of Houston. Come on. This is why I should have used my own computer, but it's working. This is Houston. This is Harris County. Over 3 days in September of 2017, it became Venice, basically. So I turned around, wrote to the Mellon Foundation, said, you know, Houston, we have a problem. We're drowning. We need support. So people need to know that they built their houses in what was once a rice field. So they should expect to flood because of rampant development. So having a map that goes back in time would show people that, look, your parcel of land was actually designed to flood, so don't be so surprised. So we did the same thing that we had done for Rio, we did for Houston, and it's the same thing. I'm going to skip it since I don't have much time. But then we also developed, like we started using deep learning models to harvest building footprints from insurance maps, because we weren't going to draw every single building in over the history of Houston. So then I had the idea of creating a spatial studies lab to do precisely that, to basically take available public information, publicly accessible information, and visualize it for the public good. That was basically the premise of this, and somehow that struck a chord, and we started getting funding from everywhere to do all sorts of visualizations based on the skills we had developed with Imagine Rio. So the first of which was, I don't know if you remember, but when COVID hit, Brazil, the federal government, or at least the Ministry of Health, would not release viral data. So we went around and asked every municipality to give us theirs, and then and sometimes they would just post the information. So we created this dashboard for viral loads, not viral loads, for positivity rates in Brazil. To my surprise, because we had these things connected to Google Analytics, we could see how many people are checking our interface. This was in the millions in 2 weeks. So suddenly, in terms of impact, I was like, what have I been doing? I've been, worried about an article that will be read by 15 people, when suddenly something we did out of sheer willingness to contribute to the public goods, no more, suddenly millions of people are checking it out. Then the crisis situation room of the Ministry of Communication and Technology in Brazil started displaying our little dashboard on their own. And when I read, this was on CNN, and I was like, I could now just add a 0 at the end and ruin their day for a week. Because it's not as if they asked me to they just did it, which is fine. That was the point of doing these user interfaces. So basically, so what we had done started appearing everywhere without even us doing anything. The governor of São Paulo, every time he would do a little video post, he would have our dashboard in the background for decoration, I presume, but still. The port explosion happened, and so we did the Beirut recovery platform, which is now defunct, but there you go. I'll show you this video, I'll skip all the others. So this was, we wanted very quickly. So I was here working on my parents' apartment. The Spatial Studies Lab is in Houston, so because of the time difference, it worked beautifully. I could work in the morning, and then in the afternoon or at night, work on this. So basically, all we wanted to do is harvest all photographs uploaded to the cloud and geolocate them so that if you were in charge of a particular sector, you could quickly see what you were into, what you were getting yourself into. So this was done in 2 weeks, and all with publicly available data or data we hacked or data we stole, I mean, whatever. Every architect in town I called, give me a model you have of Beirut, we will stitch it together. We stole data from the Red Cross, but never mind. But just because they didn't protect it. But you could, so certain buildings were built after 1980, some before 1980. If after 1980, it meant they had seismic building codes that previous ones didn't. So for someone into this, they needed to have this information quickly. All right, so I want to show you. This doesn't work like on a Mac, but it's okay. Have I gone too long? Are you still interested, or I can stop? So no, I want to show you because we also, so here we geosituated views, but we also did that with videos from YouTube and from Twitter at the time. I want to show that next. The video is a bit too long. To get to that video. Okay, too bad. You don't have to see this again. So then other tragedies started happening. So when the invasion of Ukraine happened, we thought it would be smart to look at Twitter feeds and based on words to see where the Russians were. And that did not last long, but then others came to us with other problems that we could visualize for them. A volcano in the Atlantic, the court decisions on drugs. So we could figure out which judge sends whom to prison for longer for the same crime. Then the city of Houston came to us because of our COVID mini success, and we visualized for them no longer positivity rates, but actually viral loads that they were sampling from sewage. And speaking of sewage, we've been mapping sewage overflows in Houston, which shows that they happen in the poor part of town, they happen far less in the rich part of town. And so I'm going to finish now. So now, guess what? We're going to do the same thing here with a cloud innovation lab in the dean's office. Here is, so this is actually harvesting hotspot data from NASA. This is South Lebanon. So this is on October 7. This is on October 27. This is hotspot. This is NASA satellite looking all over the planet for hotspots. It can be anything. But there was nothing before. So this is more recent. This is June 19. War on Gaza, the United Nations, actually, they have blast data they make available. So this is, I can't see the date, so this is October 15. All these are explosions. This is much more recent, so we went from 4% to 55% destruction, and that percentage we're calculating by simply harvesting OpenStreetMap building footprints, which happen to coincide exactly with explosions. So every one of these dots is actually hitting one building over the whole Gaza Strip. And finally, I'll finish with this. Come on. So this is a temporally accurate atlas of Lebanon's coastline. So the idea is to invite people from earth sciences, from archaeology, and from other disciplines to provide data they are willing to provide that we can put in the same environment, as long as it has a location and a date. All right. You get the picture. All right, that's it. Thank you. Sorry if I took longer than I was supposed to.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Thank you, Dean Dahdah. This was impressive, especially for the geeks amongst us. So I'm going to invite our panelists to join me on stage. Before we continue, I want to please ask everyone to put their phones in silent mode, and also to please do not, interject or ask a question in the middle of the panel. There will be time for Q&A at the end, but we want to try and, not to disrupt the flow of the conversation. We're lucky to have, a distinguished panel. Each panelist will really have significant added value to the conversation. So let's hear what they have from them, and then there will be some time at the end to ask a few questions. Thank you, Alex, and you can take it from here.
Can everyone hear me? Great. I'll start by admitting that I'm very intimidated by this clip-on microphone.
The journalists in the room. This is for you. Okay, put it on this side. You don't have to keep turning your.
Also with journalists.
It's better, but it's split on the shirt, not on the.
And I just, I'll use the normal.
Yeah.
How about now? Great. This is much easier. Okay. First, thank you so much to Antoine, to AUB, NCC. Thank you, Dean Ferris, for that really motivating first part of this session. I'm going to also admit this is an extremely self-interested, self-serving panel for me, as the topic is one that I and Synapse are thinking about constantly, which can be boiled down to a simple question, which is how do you make research useful? And more specifically here, how do you make environmental research useful, and whom do we make it useful to? And so in the context of Lebanon specifically and the Middle East and North Africa generally, I see three kind of big structural challenges to making useful information, all of which we're going to drill down to into this panel. So one is the question of resourcing. There's just not enough money in the region for the amount of knowledge production that needs to happen. What money does exist tends to be very Western and tends to be very English-centric. So the AUB, for instance, is a phenomenal resource. It's also the American University in Beirut, and it's largely producing in English. A second structural issue is the question of data. So we've learned now that where data is scarce, one option is to steal it from the Lebanese Red Cross. But oftentimes it's either not there, or it's there and it's inaccessible, or it's there and it's unreliable. So that's a challenge in Lebanon, but also in much of the rest of the region. And then a third challenge is figuring out who the audience is. So in Lebanon, if you take, for instance, the fire over the weekend at the Burj Hamoud landfill, if you want to talk about documenting the causes and consequences of that episode, who are you doing it for? Is it the Lebanese Ministry of Health? Is it the municipality? Is it Ramco? Is it the community around the landfill who frankly doesn't have time to read about how such a fire wildfire is impacting their health. So all of these are real challenges that our team is kind of thinking through every day. So I'm really grateful to have such an esteemed group of panelists to think them through with. So I'll very briefly introduce everyone, and then we'll dive in. So we have Maya Jbeili, who is the Reuters bureau chief for Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, and formerly a correspondent with the Thomson Reuters Foundation, where she was working on climate change, among other issues. We have Dana Hourani from The Public Source, which everyone should read if they do not do so yet. We have Dr. Fadi Al-Jaddali, who's a professor of health policy and systems here at AUB, and also the founder and director of the Knowledge to Policy Center. So we'll be asking a lot about how to turn academic research into policy-relevant information. And then you may have noticed that Christine Beckerly does not look like Lina Rutuk, and indeed is not Lina Rutuk. So Lina sadly had a personal issue and wasn't able to join, and Christine very kindly jumped in at the last minute. Christine is a economic, social, and cultural rights advisor for Amnesty International, where her portfolio includes environmental rights. So first, before getting into the meat of the panel, I wanted to do a quick icebreaker question for each panelist by way of indicating that environmental knowledge production matters at a very kind of personal level. So I'll ask each of you just very briefly, what is one piece of media or research or culture or anything that affected the way you see your work on the environment?
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to AUB for hosting this discussion. I had to think about this quite a bit, so I have an adolescent answer and I have an adult answer. So my adolescent answer is from I think I was 12 or 13, and I was reading this when I was in high school. It's a book called A Civil Action, and it's about a court case from the 80s of tanneries basically dumping their waste into a river in Massachusetts, and the lawyer that had to kind of investigate this. It's a true story. And the lawyer that had to investigate it, and basically the story ends with like, he's completely broke. Like he used to be this all, amazing, luxurious kind of 5-star lawyer, and he ends up completely broke trying to prove that these tanneries had dumped wastewater that gave these children leukemia in this town in the northeastern US. And I think what it taught me really primarily was that was a lot of the things that we're talking about today. Sometimes the data is not available. Sometimes you have to go out yourself and prove it, create it, find it, and that the kind of the assumption that people respect the public good to the extent that you do was also a misgiven assumption, and that corporations and governments will lie to protect their interests, and that you might end up broke at the end of your journey also. So I think this was my adolescent answer from when I was a kid. And then now, I think, from my work with the foundation, one of the most important kind of reads, I guess, for me was the IPCC's report from 2021, which basically admitted that there was not enough research on the Global South and from the Global South for them to be able to provide a kind of review like they do for other countries. And I think it was something that, again, that we all know and we all have felt, because when we try to do that knowledge production ourselves, we struggle with the data. But kind of seeing it finally written on paper was, I think, was a kind of moment of like, okay, now that we've named the problem, can we address the problem? So I cheated with 2 answers, but.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, AUB, for hosting today's panel. For me, it was a research paper, a master's thesis, actually, by architect Sandra Frem. She wrote it in 2009. It's on Beirut River, so it's called Nahar Beirut, Projections on an Infrastructural Landscape. So for me, I knew nothing about, I knew little to nothing about the Beirut River. And when I read her paper, I understood that it played a very vital part in Lebanon, and especially in the capital. For example, I didn't know that it was important for the surrounding communities. It was used for irrigation. It was used for recreational activities. People used to swim there. People used to fish there. A lot of delicacies apparently were fished from the river. So that was shocking for me. And also, her paper detailed the history and the degradation of the river over time, and she also had a proposal there, and she offered solutions. I don't think they're applicable right now, but I think at the time they were. And that gave me a glimmer of hope, and it was nice to see someone work on a very neglected river. It was also the only research I could find on the Beirut River that was so much in depth, and everything else that came afterwards cited this specific research paper. So honestly, it inspired me to write and research about the Beirut River, which I did. So I'm now writing about the Beirut River because of this one specific person. And hopefully, all this information, all this history that I learned about the river, I can convey to the readers, especially to the younger generations that might think that this is how the Beirut River actually looks like, but it's not. It used to have an amazing history, and hopefully that's going to be useful for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone watch the movie Don't Look Up? You know, I think this is one of the interesting movies, and I think for people who haven't watched it, you have to watch it. I think Leonardo DiCaprio, Meryl Streep, I think this was 2 years ago or so, but it's a fascinating movie that influenced the way I look actually about everything that's really taking place when it comes to climate change. And this is really a movie about big comet really approaching the Earth that will lead to destruction. And in fact, although this is a comic movie, I think it's a brilliant illustrations of how we as a humanity approach urgent crisis. In fact, we look at urgent crisis at a time when it's too late to act. And this is really what is really taking place now in the whole thing when it comes to environmental movement, as well as specifically on climate change. I was just coming actually, last week we had a big global evidence summit in Prague. And I have to say, most of the sessions that we attended, and Lama was with me, Lama Bukaroum, the research manager, she's here. And most of the session that we attended was actually talking about, are we getting the right evidence when it comes to climate change? So it can be used for activism, it can be used for policy advocacy. And what type of evidence that is really there? To what extent we are really producing, we're maybe, bringing the noise and the music at the same time. So it's not really that we are in a crisis, but what are the feasible solutions that can be addressed globally, particularly, as you know, in climate change, when it comes to pollution and global emission, 10 countries out of 197 are responsible for 70% of the emission. So we're talking about 10 countries that have a huge political tensions and economic tensions that you want them actually to address the cost of the climate change. So that's the first, maybe an icebreaker. But another one that we got really interested in environment, way back when the waste management crisis in 2014, 2015 in Lebanon, believe it or not, almost 10 years since then, we're still actually not being able to address the basic, simple problem in the case of Lebanon is waste management crisis. At that time in K2P, we produced actually, and at that time we collaborated with NCC, Najat was here at that time, and we actually produced a paper that actually respond to what would be the feasible solution based on the most effective interventions. But again, the issue is not really sometimes the availability of the evidence or to address the problem is really how this evidence is really integrated in the way we think about policy and policy decisions. That's something we can talk about it later.
So first of all, I will say I'm sorry that Lena is not here. And if you get a chance to hear from Lena at another time, you should definitely take it because she's very amazing and very impressive. But to quickly answer the question about two sort of pieces of work that changed me. I'm going to answer two books that changed me over the last year, and in particular impacted the way in which I think about my own position in work. So I really only came to work on the environment and climate related issues over the last maybe year or 2 years. Before that, I was kind of more of what you would call a traditional human rights person. And it's in the name, right? When you're talking about human rights, you're tending to focus on the rights of humans. And there has been a lot of interesting theoretical work about how do you expand that? How do you think about planetary boundaries? What does human rights have to offer when we're talking about plants, animals, sort of what we owe to the earth as well, not just to humans themselves. And I had read a lot of academic work on this, but this past year I read a book by a journalist actually called The Light Eaters. And the book is just about, it's walking through how plants sense the world. And it was the first time reading through someone trying to puzzle through what science tells us about how we understand kind of life other than us that really kind of hit me at kind of like a fundamental spiritual level. And I think had this question for me of what is my circle of responsibility? And if I'm a human rights person, what does that mean in terms of thinking about the rights and this rights framework that in a way has been quite blind to various things that you actually need to think about if we're talking about sort of a sustainable future for all of us. More cynically, a second book that I read this year that really sort of fundamentally made me think about what my role is as a person who does human rights advocacy. If you haven't read it, check it out. It's by Amitav Ghosh. It's called The Great Derangement. And one of the things that he talks about is kind of the very nice but naive climate and environmental activists who spend their time trying to convince people, say, for example, these 10 countries, that they should be less bad because the poor and vulnerable of the world are going to be more affected by climate change than the rich and powerful. And what Amitav Ghosh says is, that's all very nice, but are you actually going to convince them? So back to Maya's question, there's this assumption that if we can just get people to care enough, maybe we can change their behavior. And what Amitav Ghosh says is, will that actually work? And I think for me, that sort of is something that I'm still thinking about, because the fundamental way in which we as human rights people tend to do our work is sort of trying to say, if we produce the information, if we show how you are harming people, you will change your behavior. But I think in particular this past year, there's this question of, will you?
Thanks a lot. It's really a lovely range of answers. Two things I'll quickly add on the light eaters. The other thing I find relevant about that book to this discussion is that it's to a certain extent a journalist translating academics. So it's largely the story of all of these kind of out there plant scientists who are running around in the rainforests of Chile and whatnot, writing extremely technical work that's limited to a very small sphere of academia, and so this woman goes out and spends however many years chasing the story and turns it into a book which is now a bestseller and can kind of become part of the zeitgeist in the U.S. And then I appreciated the point on Amitav Ghosh and kind of who were advocating to. So I had a conversation last year with a Tunisian activist on kind of whether there's any point in doing advocacy vis-a-vis European countries or the US when it comes to environmental issues. And her take was basically that she's done the thing where she tries to convince Western countries not to be colonialist, and she doesn't believe it's going to work. So let's think about what the alternatives are. Anyway, now to the more substantive, challenging questions. Starting with Maya. So Maya, we've known each other quite a while. You've been a journalist in the Middle East for something like a decade now. And so in that time, Mabruk. In that time, we've seen climate change and environmental degradation become much more mainstream globally, and also in Lebanon to an extent, as Dr. Fadi pointed out, the waste crisis here being a big crisis moment. So I wanted to ask you, do you see a turning point when newsrooms within the region began to cover environmental issues more seriously? And the second question is, what differences you see in how climate change or the environment is covered in Arabic versus international media?
So I think right off the bat, I think there's no natural homegrown turning point. I mean, I thought about this for a while when you asked the question, and I think it's really, to be very cynical, but to kind of reference some of the issues, some of the points that we've already raised. I think it's basically when Western money started being interested in funding this as kind of the latest pot of interesting issues for it. So if you remember, maybe 10 years ago, like the hot topic was CVE, PVE. Everybody was talking about CVE, PVE, countering violent terrorism, violent extremism, and preventing violent extremism. And that's where all the money was focused, and that's where all the trainings were focused, and that's where a lot of the journalism was also focused, because it just became, again, this like knowledge production cycle, and that's how the wheel was turning at the time. And now, unfortunately, I mean, maybe fortunately, it's focused on climate issues. But the reason I say unfortunately is that it's not necessarily sustainable, right? Because as soon as these funding streams shift to whatever the next subject is going to be, then we're probably, I will say probably, sadly, going to see newsrooms start to shift those focuses, and those journalist positions that are funded specifically to look at climate are not going to be funded anymore. I mean, my position when I was working at the Thomson Reuters Foundation for a year between 2021 to 2022, and my remit was climate, inclusive economies primarily, and tech. That position was funded by USAID when I was working, ultimately. When I was working there, and in the months afterwards, after I left and joined Reuters as a news reporter again, and I was asked to come to a couple of different training sessions for journalists, including people who worked extensively in northern Syria and opposition-held areas, who were now being asked to shift their reporting from the conflict in northern Syria that was no longer a top story to reporting more on climate issues, and being asked to train these reporters on how to do more climate coverage. That was also because they had received money from a German foundation to do the training for these journalists. So again, I mean, in my own experience, it was very much linked to where Western money was going. On the question of the difference between local and international media, I did my own I thought about this a little bit, and I also asked, because I don't consider myself a normal news consumer, just because I read it, I have to read it and then I have to produce it, so I'm not really, the lines are blurred. So I asked a couple of friends who are really avid news consumers, in Arabic in particular, what they read and what they look for when they, kind of do their scans of the headlines in the morning. And most of them said that they do not find climate coverage. Maybe it could be there and they don't even see it, but that tells us a lot as well, that it's not something that they're actually even kind of registering as being there. And now, if you go on Sharq al-Awsat, if you go on some of the regional pan-Arab papers, if you go on the National in English as well, you will find climate coverage. But for people who are avid news consumers from the region to say that they're not even registering it is important. One of the people I asked gave me an even kind of more nuanced answer, which was that he works part-time in Belgium, and when he's in Brussels, he owns a car there and he drives it. He told me, when I'm in Brussels and I have to think about the fact that parking spots are prioritized for electric vehicles, and I drive a diesel car, which means I can't park in certain areas, but I also can't access certain parts of Brussels, I care about the climate. And when I'm in Lebanon, where I don't have to think about these things, I don't care about the climate. And that reinforces something that really, I think the fundamental difference here is that for international news coverage and international readers who are based abroad and who are reading the news about other countries, climate coverage is linked to every other type of issue. So if you open the New York Times climate page right now, there's going to be stories about insurance companies that are covering for climate disaster. There's going to be stories about court cases against companies that are not fulfilling their pledges. There are going to be a range of stories that cover climate, not just from the question of is the Earth getting hotter or not. It's going to be about all the different facets of a citizen's daily life that is impacted by this issue. Unfortunately, in the region, climate coverage is very much siloed to, today there's a fire, and tomorrow there's a heat wave, and the day after that there's a flood. And unfortunately, we're living the most extreme manifestations of climate change, but they're not being linked to the bigger picture. And that's not journalism's fault. I mean, part of it is going to be journalism's fault because we need to try to make those linkages. But I think fundamentally the issue is that the institutions and the infrastructure to link all these issues together, and the relative stability that you need for there to be those institutions built up don't exist. And so it becomes very difficult for us to as journalists that want to make this an issue that is kind of a dinner table discussion, it becomes very difficult for us to get a reader interested, because all we can say is, okay, all I can see is today is a flood, and all I can see is tomorrow there's a fire and there's a drought the next day. Furthering this, and I'll just make this my last point, is that we can't also, one of the things that we find really difficult is that we, back to the issue of data, is that we're stuck as journalists reporting on these issues, again, just as singular events, because there's a really limited amount of information that we can rely on to demonstrate to readers that there is a trend. So we can say that, for example, the region is heating up, twice as fast as the rest of the world, or that there's more kind of droughts and extreme weather events in the region than there are in other parts of the world, et cetera. But at some point, I can't tell you that, this climate event is happening 10 times more than it used to happen 40 years ago, and scientists are projecting that it will be happening 30 times more often in 10 years. Without that data, and with a responsible journalist cannot then tell the audience, this is an issue that matters to you because you're going to see a flood every single day from now until your grandkids die. That's the kind of, speaking of don't look up, I mean, that's the kind of dramatization that a journalist also needs to make to get people to pay attention. If we don't have the data, we can't do it responsibly. And that's why I think you'll see in most coverage in the region, these climate events are just covered as like singular events. And at some point, people start to tune out because you're just seeing another drought, another flood, another fire, and it's less and less and less interesting because it's not news anymore. So unfortunately, that whole cycle is really impacting the amount of engagement that we get from readers. And at Reuters, I mean, now in the past year, I can tell you that we have done 0 climate stories because there's a fundamental reality in the region, which is Gaza and the South. And with shrinking newsrooms, if we have to make a call on what we're going to cover, it's not going to be a forest fire. So, thank you.
I know, very well put. The only thing that I would question, and which we can discuss later, if not in this session, then subsequently, is on the funding cycles. I think the one difference with climate relative to other fads is that climate is actually imposing itself. Like, it's not made up in Western capitals. So I think this is distinct from other kind of gimmicks that we go through, in that it is making itself more and more urgent, and will only keep doing so. So we'll see. I think it could go either way. And so moving from kind of international to local journalism, public source I appreciate for many reasons, not least that it's a rare local news organization doing serious, in-depth investigative coverage of environmental issues, among others. So Dana, you specifically in the last 6 months or so wrote 2 investigations that I really liked, not least because they were so different from one another. So one was about the impact of Israeli deployment of white phosphorus in the south, and another was about animal rescue efforts in Lebanon. So one of those being kind of, as Maya put it, that's part of the story. Like, that's what's happening and what must be written about, and I would assume would have a pretty natural audience. Whereas animal rescue efforts might be kind of the other end of the spectrum, where to someone like me, it's extremely important and interesting, but others might wonder why we're talking about saving the hyenas when we also have white phosphorus to talk about. So I'd love to hear, first of all, how you think about the objectives of such different pieces of writing, and second, if you noticed any difference in the responses you got to them.
Okay, so actually these 2 articles were part of a broader series at the public source that we do on environmental and climate issues. So over the past 2 years, we've been writing on varied topics such as seed, saving soil, beekeeping, water. And so when I started working on white phosphorus, obviously it felt very urgent because Israel started using white phosphorus immediately, like a few days into the war. And being from the South, I felt personally affected. I felt the damage. So I felt like it was a responsibility for me to report on the topic. Obviously, there's the part of documentation because Israel is not being held accountable, and they are able to use this illegal weapon without any repercussions. So there's that side. There's also the environmental impact because this is basically a substance from hell. It can penetrate aquifers. It can cause dangers to crops and to animals. It can burn through the flesh. It can cause respiratory problems, and it can cause damage to crops. It burns them down completely. It is important to note that we still have no research on the long-term effects of white phosphorus, so we still have no idea what's going to happen, and hopefully we will learn more. But there's also the human side of this story, because I felt in the first few months of reporting, which were the first few months of the war, people like readers and people were seeing the death and the infrastructural damage happening to South Lebanon. But the changes and the damages to the daily lives, I felt that wasn't being reported on enough, and people were not able to relate to the extent of the pain that people from South Lebanon were living on the daily. So that's something I wanted to focus on. So for example, a farmer from Kfar Kala, a bordering village, he's called Maher al-Sayyid, and he was telling me about how he had to watch his cows die in front of him because they suffocated from white phosphorus, and he had to take them to another village, but he had no options because it was very expensive for him to do so. And he got a vet, he got doctors, but no one understood white phosphorus, so they had no idea what to do. So he had to watch them die one after the other. And to quote him, "I saw them die in front of my eyes after I had seen them born from their mother's wombs, after I fed them, raised them, and spent time with them." He spent time with them more than he spent with his own children. And as I was talking to him on the phone, he told me he was watching them die. So obviously, I felt a kind of heartbreak that I couldn't describe, and I really wanted to relate to the readers this kind of heartbreak, because it's not just about the damages to the land, which is very important, but obviously there's damage to people's lives. And the second farmer, Uday Abu Sari, from the bordering village of Kfar Kala, he lost his livelihood, he lost his land. It was completely burned down because of white phosphorus, and it was a land inherited from his father, who inherited from his father, and so on. And even then, he refused to leave. He is still in Dhaira, and he wanted to salvage as much as he could, so he stayed there, and he said, "I don't mind working under Israeli airplanes because I'm not doing anything wrong." So at the public source, we didn't want to do just reporting for the sake of reporting, because this was a widely covered topic. So I wanted to bring something new, something additional for the readers. And this was the concept of the resistance of the people, as exemplified by these farmers, and of resistant crops. So South Lebanon is characterized by crops that are called ba'aliyah, which are crops that can survive in harsh climates, such as tobacco, figs, grapes, and olives. And to quote author Munira Khayyat, "South Lebanon is a place that the Israelis just don't know what to do with, because no matter how hard they bash it, people are refusing to no longer live there." Eco Warriors piece, the one about animal activism, honestly, it felt interesting to shed a light on activists and groups that people maybe didn't know a lot about, and because they were able to still care about the environment, to still care about wildlife, in basically in a country that was falling apart despite the economic crisis, political deadlock, and now the war. They still prioritize the environment and animals. Also, it was important for me to dispel a myth around these animals that paint them as ferocious monsters that we should kill, whether it's the hyena, the jackal, the shark. So, for example, one of the most popular myths on the hyena, which is Lebanon's national animal, is that they urinate on their tail and then throw this on a person's eye to mesmerize them, and then drag this person into a cave to kill them. Obviously not true. The hyena hates people and they want to be left alone. So it's actually it's an innocent creature. They are very important for the ecosystem. So in terms of response, white phosphorus obviously generated a lot of interest because it was urgent and people were eager to learn more about this. And people from South Lebanon especially felt seen and they felt represented. Eco Warriors, the one about animals, I felt it offered a sort of respite, and people really enjoyed the sense of positivity, the sense of hope that it brought, and they really enjoyed knowing of these people that really inspire. And it's nice to have sometimes just a bit of hope in this country. And here I want to make an honorable mention of Sulala Animal Rescue in Gaza. and they are taking care of animals right now in Gaza amid the genocide. So if you guys want to check them out, they're doing really amazing work. They are still doing work, and if you can help, please do. They are truly inspirational, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate it. And then now moving from journalism to academic research, Fadi, you're in a very interesting position in what's obviously not just a leading research institution in Lebanon, but in the entire region, and kind of bridging that gap from academic research into policy in what one could call a challenging policy environment, to say the least. So I wanted to ask you, when you think about the challenges to making policy in Lebanon, the fragmentation of the state, the budget shortages, and so on, how do you factor that into the process of generating evidence for policy making? And especially, what have you found works, given how difficult it is?
So let me start by just going back also to the global theme, because much of if we really talk about the environmental policies and climate change, this is now a really big buzzword and the global priority everywhere. But I want to link it back to research, and I have to say, when you look at the research that's being produced, because you want research to influence policy, the question always we ask, to what extent this research is policy relevant? To what extent this research is responding to the needs of politicians, of policymakers, of legislators, of journalists, of others. So I think this is the policy relevance of the research is extremely important. But when we say policy relevance, meaning, researchers should understand the priorities and what is really needed to conduct research about. And I have to say, particularly in the climate change, interestingly, if you look over the last many years of research production, you can see a lot of research on the impact of climate change on health, impact of climate change in the economy, impact so the impact on, but not a lot of research on climate change, in fact. And I think this is really quite interesting to start really reflecting a little bit, even we as a UB here, what are some of the priorities that are really required at the level of local, regional, and a global level. When last week in Prague, there was a lot of discussion about how much researchers should start utilizing AI to start really looking for simulation models, for bringing solutions, particularly that most countries are really now, when they talk about climate change, either you have the adaptation policy or the mitigation policy, and both requires a lot of significant evidence base. So, but let me go back to your question. I think, and I want to talk a little bit mostly from the health, because over the last several years, I have to say that we've learned a lot, that there are three important things that you have to do. First of all, you need to have the right research that address a policy priority. Second, you need to invest in evidence synthesis. You don't need to actually reinvest the wheel and conduct research on something you already have evidence about. So that's why how we are harnessing the power of systematic reviews, high quality evidence, meta-analysis, whatever, and there's a lot and significant work is being done, including on environmental policies and climate change and others. And third thing is about knowledge translation. To what extent we are framing the issues in a way that can resonate with the target audience. Sometimes as researchers, we speak with ourselves. So we just we publish articles, which this is what we're supposed to do. But at the end, do you expect policymakers will have time to read your article? If they read 1 or 2 pages from a report you provide to them, that you're lucky. So the question is really how you are really simplifying, translating this type of complex data, and evidence in a very simple, straightforward message. What is the cost of inaction, and what is the benefit of action? That's what politicians care about. So it's very important. Now, for example, in the UK, they are convinced, policymakers and politicians are convinced about the cost of climate, about the intervention that they need to do to mitigate and to adapt to climate change. But you know what is the issue? In 2024, I think 2045, it will cost them around 1% of GDP, around $25 billion to actually do this type of intervention. From where they're going to get the money? That's the question that they want to care about. They are not against intervention. So the question, what we have learned, and I think I put some thoughts on, at least from a K2P perspective, what we have learned over the last many years of how to effectively translate the knowledge. First of all, context matters. You need to make sure that even if there is a global study, you need to actually make it locally applicable to your context. Policymakers are not interested to say, okay, in the UK, in France, in the US, this is what they are doing. Tell me what is really happening in my context. Second is really how to make sure that evidence plays a very important role in the decision-making process. I worked in government before. I haven't seen a policy, truly. I haven't seen a policy that is 100% based on evidence. I mean it. I work in Canada in 3 levels of government before I came back to Lebanon and the region. I tell you, there's many factors that come to play in the public policy making processes. But the question is how to make sure that evidence is an important integral part among other elements that come to play into decision making process. We're not yet there. How بالعربي كيف فينا نمأسس استخدام الأدلة والبراهين والresearch? How to institutionalize the use of it. This is something that, and of course, co-production of evidence. Are you engaging stakeholders and policymakers in your research? Because they are the consumers of your research. If you don't engage them early on, you will never be able to actually get them to hear what you're doing. So that's why I think it's the policy relevance type of nature, of research, accessibility, but also to making sure that this is actually bringing value and impact. So that's why we've done, going back to the media, I agree with you that you need data. And I agree with you that sometimes journalists miss the bigger picture. And that's what is the issue. Particularly in the context of Lebanon and the region, we only report in cases, but we don't follow through in the story and look at the bigger picture. But one thing we've learned as well, that also even journalists don't have the capacity to deal with complex data. The question really how we can simplify that. In K2P, we created something called one page called Media Byte. It's just how you can really simplify complex data on something in a very simple way that can actually bring emotional, sensational nature to that, because this is how journalists write about it. But to link it to the bigger picture. So I think there's a lot to be done also at the receiving end when it comes, because I believe media and journalists play a very important role in shaping and influencing public opinion and policy. To all this to say, I think we need to not only invest on identifying priorities, we need to make sure they are policy relevant, conduct research that produce data that answers tough questions. Policymakers are, they are not researchers, but their questions are crisp and clear and sharp. Are we ready to answer those questions? I think that's the type of, so this is where what we have learned, I think, from the context of this. So research is important, but is not enough to influence policy. I think we need to do more of how to take that into the knowledge translation, and there's a lot of effective intervention of how to do that.
Very well put. Thank you so much. And so coming now to Christine, who's the last on the panel and also the only lawyer on the panel, unless somebody else is a lawyer and I missed that, in which case I apologize. So Christine, you mentioned having come to the environmental field relatively recently, and when you were quite early in that process, you did some intensive field work in Yemen, which is a country that you know very well, but from the perspective of documenting conflict. So I'd love to hear what you found kind of going back to Yemen, looking at it through a different lens, and specifically how you see environmental issues fitting into a broader human rights agenda in Yemen.
I'm outed as a lawyer. Okay. So basically, one thing that I want to use to frame my answer is that when you traditionally think of human rights documentation and advocacy, first of all, like one thing that separates kind of human rights organizations when they're doing research is they are very explicitly doing with it an aim of advocacy. So it's not we're going in and we're going to kind of do this research and hope for the best. It's you're going in and you're hoping to use that research to change something in the world. And that's why you have human rights organizations that will have explanations of their theory of change, which is often something boiled down to investigate, expose, change. So you do the research, you publish that research, and then you use that to try and change something in the world. And they do that linked to the international human rights legal framework, which at a very basic level requires you to show a person harmed, so whose rights were violated, an actor who caused that harm, which could be a state, could be a person, could be a non-state armed group, and a violation of the law. And the reason I'm saying all of that is, as Alex said, before I went on this trip to Yemen last year, I had been working on Yemen since 2015, 2016, really focusing on kind of the traditional things you think about, I think, when you think about human rights documentation. So during conflict, airstrikes, landmines, arbitrary detention, torture. And frankly, if I'm being totally honest, when I was in that space, it wasn't that there weren't very serious environmental issues going on in Yemen. It wasn't that climate change wasn't already impacting people in Yemen. It wasn't even that there weren't already Yemeni activists and Yemeni organizations who were prioritizing issues related to the environment and climate. And it certainly wasn't the case that international human rights law has nothing to say about environmental harms and climate change, because it actually does have a lot to say about it. But it was more that myself and my colleague felt completely overwhelmed, kind of similar to what Maya was saying with Reuters, by all of the various other violations that felt urgent and timely and that you had to focus on. Because for any of you who have been following the conflict in Yemen, it's been a rough one for people living in the country. But when we went back this past year, I think two things struck me as fundamentally the same about approaching human rights research on environmental or climate-related issues, and two things struck me as different but not insurmountably different. So the two things that struck me as fundamentally the same, kind of in very intense ways, was that really in a lot of cases when you're looking at what's going on in Yemen, the same communities that are being impacted by environmental harms and by climate change are often the exact same communities that have been worst impacted by the war. That's sort of obvious in some ways, but to give a very clear example, in my kind of traditional human rights hat, I had done work on the impact of the war on Yemenis fishing communities, who had kind of been tossed around by the various warring parties, by the Saudis, by the UAE, by the Yemeni government, by the Houthi armed group. When we went back this time, we did a bunch of interviews with some of the members of Yemen's fishing communities. And in addition to all of that, there are leaking oil tankers off the coast of Yemen that have just been like leaking oil into the Gulf of Aden, which obviously has huge impacts on fishing stocks, which has meant that fishing communities have to go further out to try and get fish. When they go further out to try and get fish, they're more exposed to, for example, either the militaries or the fighting forces that are involved in the Yemen conflict, or even from the Horn of Africa. So you've had people, Yemeni fishermen, get detained by the Saudis, by the Ethiopians. You've gotten them taken hostage by various like pirates or kind of armed groups. And in addition to the kind of environmental harms from the pollution, you also have the fact that the sea is getting hotter, the sea is getting more acidic, so that is also impacting the fishing stocks, that is also impacting the way in which they can sort of maintain their livelihoods. And I want to say the fishing community in Yemen is not a small community. Sort of below fossil fuels, the fishing kind of part of the economy in Yemen is like the second most important part of the Yemeni economy. So it's actually quite an important community that provides for, I think, around 100,000 households. Like, it's a lot of people that you're talking about. So same communities getting impacted by kind of these range of crises. In some ways, it's the same actors causing the harm. So in the conflict in Yemen, you have the Saudis and the Emiratis who have been involved in the aerial campaign for many years. You also have the US that has been involved in Yemen. And you have the Yemeni government and the Houthi armed group that have kind of fundamentally failed to protect people from environmental harms, from the impacts of climate change. The two things that are quite different, and this is where I'll wrap it up, is that one of the reasons I think it's been hard to produce human rights research on environmental harms and climate change is something that Maya alluded to earlier, which is the fundamental challenges of causation and attribution. So for causation, to prove a violation of a law, you need to show the link between the wrongdoing actor's conduct and the harm that is caused to the person whose rights were violated. So if I can show, for example, that X actor is the one that owns the ship that's leaking oil into the sea and is causing the fish to flee, can I actually show that that oil is the sole cause or the primary cause of the fish to flee, particularly given that I just said that also the fact that the sea is getting hotter and more acidic is also impacting the fish? fish. So you have that causation problem with a lot of environmental and climate change research that is tough for human rights researchers. And then on attribution, similarly, can I explicitly link some harm that I am seeing? Say, for example, in the east of Yemen, there's been oil spills all over the place. Can I link the health impacts that communities are facing to those oil spills and thus to the fossil fuel company? And for human rights researchers, part of the reason this is tough is that sometimes you're going to the same sources of data or information to sort of prove your case. For example, interviews with people impacted. Other times you need to go elsewhere. You might need to go, for example, to academic research. You might need to go to government data. Sometimes that information exists, sometimes that information does not exist. And so I think these research challenges then create a problem on the advocacy space. So again, you're doing the research to cause change in the world. And if you can't prove a clear causation story, meaning this actor did this thing, so that actor needs to stop doing that thing, it makes advocacy much harder. Similarly, on attribution, if I'm actually saying, well, maybe there's 4 to 5 to 6 different actors who are involved in this harm, it also makes advocacy much harder. Because all of a sudden, I'm not saying, you, Christine, stop this thing. I'm saying, you, Christine, Alex, Maya, Donna, Dr. Fadi, you all need to stop. And that's a harder advocacy message than just, you, Christine, need to stop. Let's all get on board making Christine stop this thing. So I think that really kind of is something that we in the human rights community generally are sort of working through.
Thanks a lot. So that was a wonderful first round of input. I haven't been keeping time super closely as I really wanted to hear the ends of all those interventions. But so we have 30 minutes left. I want to try to protect close to 20 minutes for question and answer. So if the panelists will forgive me, I'm going to ask for a speed round of answers to my second question. So we'll aim for like 2.5 minutes each, and leave the last 20 for Q&A. So we'll go in reverse order this time. So Christine, shortly after your Yemen trip, you were at the UAE, you were at COP28 in Dubai. Tell us why that was awkward.
Okay, speed round. So maybe you got this from my last answer. The UAE has been deeply involved in terrible things in Yemen, like deeply involved in terrible things. Most of my friends in the Yemen human rights community are like, frankly, extremely afraid of the UAE. So as you can probably tell, I am an American woman with like a strong passport, and many of my friends in Yemen were telling me not to go to the UAE because they were worried that something terrible would happen. Because like when you've seen people arbitrarily detained, tortured, assassinated by either this actor or actors supported by them, you learn to be afraid. So the notion that I was supposed to go to the UAE and have these like deep, wonderful conversations about how to solve the issues of climate change just felt unlikely to succeed. And also it meant that many of the people that I knew in Yemen who were grappling with these issues, who frankly know more about this stuff than I did, would never go to the UAE for COP28. They would never, ever go. And so it meant that I was going knowing that a huge portion of people who like really need to be a part of this conversation were not going to be a part of this conversation. And the other reason I think I found it awkward is that in many ways, the UAE, Yemen, Saudi, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, like the whole Gulf, they are facing very similar challenges when it comes to climate change, extreme heat, lacking water. Honestly, it kind of goes across the region, but their capacities to cope with these challenges are fundamentally different by the very nature that GCC states have tons of money, Yemen does not. So recent study says Riyadh, Dubai, and Al Hodeidah in Yemen are going to be some of the hottest cities with climate change. Hodeidah, like, they don't have AC. Like, these people are not going to be able to sustain extreme heat in the way someone in Dubai or Riyadh can. Similarly, when we're in Yemen, we're looking at the right to water. They were all waiting, saying, oh, we hope Saudi and the UAE will help us out with desalination, because they know that, yes, okay, the Gulf has no water, but the Gulf can pump in a ton of money and a ton of fossil fuels into creating water for itself when a country like Yemen does not have that option. So to be in the UAE saying, okay, we're going to help solve climate change, knowing that the people who needed to be a part of the conversation were not there, and that fundamentally, even though it was the same challenge, the way in which people were thinking about what possible solutions were was fundamentally different, and frankly excluding of most of the people who were going to be impacted in the worst ways, made it feel like what are we even doing? And is this really the place where we're going to solve the problems that are confronting us? And I will say, leaving COP28, I think the answer was resoundingly no. Like those are not the spaces that we're going to solve the issues that are facing us and facing the people that I'm assuming most people in this room care about.
Thanks a lot, Christine. And so, Fadi, we spoke a bit about the process of translating knowledge into policy. I wanted to ask specifically about how you see AUB as an institution playing a role in kind of bridging between different communities, between academia and journalism, but also potentially between different sectors, even different countries in the region.
Sure. But can I comment, just to build on what this is very interesting, what you mentioned about the COP that was in Dubai. But, particularly climate change, I always see this problem like, the game theory and the prisoner dilemma. And countries are not really working together, because if they work together and they are rational, they can really get good results. But this is really not happening. And I think the question really how we can position this in a way that can trigger the interest and the action of those countries is not easy. I'm talking at the global scale, but absolutely this is the case now when it comes to climate change and others. But let me go back to your question on the at EB level. I have to say, and this is not EB, but from an academic standpoint, I'll come back to EB, but from an academic standpoint, we as researchers, we are more and more faced with an interconnected issues and interconnected problems. But at the same time, we are still working in silos. So to address an interconnected, contentious issue, whether it's public health, whether it's climate change, whether you name it, you need to make sure that we are actually stepping up and really rethinking about how we're doing research, how we're doing collaboration, how we can bring in more disciplines together. And I think there is a lot to be yet done. And this is really not peculiar to EB, really at the global level. I think we need to learn more about how we can really create that model that we can come together as academicians. Mind you, that I have to say that sometimes the existing structures, and this is not a criticism, but the existing structures, sometimes academic institutions, create perverse incentive for people not to collaborate. That's why you see now in some university, they are abolishing department, they're abolishing program. They want, the political scientists working with the public health worker, working with the social anthropologists, creating this type of incentive where people can come together and work. I'm not saying this is gonna or should happen. What I'm trying to say that we need to start addressing interconnected, complex problem that requires the contribution of different disciplines. We cannot continue addressing it in a siloed fashion. That's my, now, going back to UB, and I think this is extremely important. I think one of the things that we need to learn also, again, maybe not necessarily only about UB, but also as academician researchers, that, we don't own the data and we're not able to answer all the questions that the world is facing or Lebanon is struggling with. Meaning is, are we working within an evidence ecosystem? Are we actually working, for example, in public health? Are we, I'm looking at Salim because he's our, model and advocating for public health. But are we working with data modelers? Are we working with simulators? Are we harnessing AI tools now in terms of this? Are we working with political scientists, with economists, etc.? So I think it's very important to see how we can start looking at the ecosystem when it comes to evidence, so we can really generate the evidence that can actually be used effectively in policy or in advocacy. I think EB is, over the last few years, has been making major strides. I have to say that we're more and more acknowledging the importance of the interdisciplinary research. More and more entities, institutes, and centers and faculties are really working together. Now, the question is really how to maintain, sustain, and scale up this work. I think this still need yet to be done. The last thing I want to mention is that also at the EU level, we have to be more at the policy-making table. I think when I say policy-making table, not as a policymaker, as a trusted entity that can speak truth to power by evidence. And I think this is really what we have all the academic capital that can allow us to do so. And as you know, there is a work already being currently done on the GAP, which is the government engagement platform of EUB, where this is where how we can harness that academic capital and actually bring it to decision-making processes. We produce a lot of work that talks about problems. We want also to produce more and more work that talks about feasible, context-specific solutions. We want to actually follow through on close the loops. We do a lot of work on influencing laws, but trust me, it's not about shaping and influencing laws. It's about, are we looking what's happening بالمراسيم التطبيقية? But really the guidelines of action, because this is where the rubber hit the road. Much of what the laws that is being issued, either there's no marasim tatbi'i, whatever. So there's a question how we can get to the legislative body, how we can get to the parliamentary committees, because this is where really they need evidence, and this is where we can actually take action. How we are collaborating with journalists in a way that can be socially responsible and contributing to public good. It's happening, bits and pieces. I think we need to look at the whole bigger than the sum of the parts, and this is where EUB proudly is going into that direction, because I think this institution has a major is playing and can play and should play a much more stronger role, a powerful, forceful role in shaping, influencing public policy, not only in Lebanon, but also in the region.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot. And then Dana, coming back to this question of kind of figuring out what to focus on and what to help the public focus on when so much else is happening, I wanted to ask you, what are two maximum 3 issues relating to the environment that you would like to see the Lebanese public paying attention to in the months and years ahead, and which you would see yourself or the public source kind of helping people to come to terms with?
Obviously, there will be very important topics that the media will be covering in the upcoming month, especially if the war on South Lebanon comes to an end, and hopefully that will be soon. But it's also important to look at the type of coverage. So what will it look like? Will it be sensationalist? Will it be shallow? Will it be clickbaity? So at the public source, we will continue doing in-depth and rigorous journalism, especially when it comes to South Lebanon, because we will keep up with the developments. And this is where I believe all the media should turn its focus towards, especially as the war comes to an end, because we have to look at the human, ecological, and agricultural cost of war. So obviously, how will people rebuild their lives? How will people start over? Are they able to start over? What difficulties are they going to face? Will they get help? Who's giving this help? Is it being distributed equally? Also farmers, of course, we need to see what's going to happen to the land of South Lebanon. And here it's important to note that South Lebanon is not a wasteland, because when we were working on white phosphorus, we were cautioned against painting this image that the entire land of South Lebanon is now completely poisoned because of white phosphorus. Therefore, everything coming from South Lebanon, all the produce is now poisoned. That is not true, especially because we don't have evidence yet about the extent of the damage. So us as media, we really need to be cautious when reporting on South Lebanon, especially in the agricultural section. So hopefully we will know more about the extent of the damage once the war ends. And the second topic would be water, the water situation in Lebanon, and especially in South Lebanon. So obviously the water situation in Lebanon doesn't seem to be improving, whether it's infrastructural or pollution is not going to improve. And in South Lebanon specifically, given that Israel is directly targeting the water infrastructure, it's very important to look into these damages and the access to this water by southern Lebanese, especially once they return to their land. And if they are able to access this water, and the quality of water and the repercussions that's going to come afterwards. And weaponization of water is something we will focus on because it is very important. And here I'd like to just say that South Lebanon is not a war zone and is something as a journalist I always want to highlight through my work. It is a region filled with history, filled with culture, filled with stories of survival, rebuilding, starting over. And I believe as a journalist, it is important to relay that image for people so that they get a different perspective. They get a perspective of resistance, of survival. And obviously farmers and landowners and people want to go back and want to rebuild their lives. And hopefully we will be able to keep up with that and to cover these stories. And yeah, hopefully it will be nice after the war ends.
Maya, you get the last 2 minutes, and I'm not saying you have to inspire us and make us optimistic, but if you want to. So on kind of the level of investment that we've seen, even if it's very sporadic investment in recent years in environmental journalism in the region, where do you see progress being made, and what advice would you give to somebody trying to get into that type of coverage?
I think we definitely have seen newsrooms allocate more resources to climate reporting than they have been in the past. Is it where it should be? No. Is it as sustainable as it should be? No. But it's definitely more than I saw when I was starting out 11 years ago now. I would say, I mean, you would also ask kind of what is missing to do better. I think primarily I've seen plenty of partnerships where, again, like journalists are expected to train journalists on how to do climate coverage better. But I think one of the things that could be really interesting is to see partnerships possibly between scientific researchers and journalists in the region to teach them on how to do climate science, citizen science. Because fundamentally, if the problem is data and there's somebody who's interested in acquiring the data, if there's a way, obviously that would have limited applications on certain phenomena that could be studied in that way. But I think if those trainings could be much more practical and much more useful ultimately to produce the knowledge locally. And there is a level of enthusiasm, and I think that would then get journalists from the region who are not used to necessarily covering climate issues much more engaged and much more interested if they can generate the knowledge themselves. And a piece of advice to someone starting out, I mean, it's going to be complicated, and it's going to be really probably the most uphill battle to get readers to care about this issue in the region when there are so many other pressing dynamics that are kind of clamoring for their attention. But just to essentially to stay the course and to definitely network, because there are many other reporters, from different cities across the region, who are working on similar things and who. I think it's a region. It's an arena that's prime for collaboration across cities.
That's great.
Hopeful.
It's a perfect note to end on and to switch over to questions. So we have 15 minutes. Yeah. So we'll aim to take 3 questions. Yes, questions that I'm passing along from Antoine, who's the bad cop. That these are questions. They're not interventions. Yes, so
thanks so much. That was a fantastic panel. I'm really hyper stimulated, but I'm going to try and be focused with my questions. I mean, one of the things that keeps coming up for me, and it's just I'm really looking for perspective on it from the panel, is the kind of really like perverse, absurd things that are going on with how knowledge and evidence is absorbed, which is that so I worked at AUB, I worked with NCC for a while, and I've also worked on a number of consultancies in Lebanon, in the region, and whatever on environment. But the idea is that a lot of times we're talking to these policymakers, we are giving them in our very best way, working with psychologists to figure out very good ways to give this evidence, and we get a great round of applause, and that's it. And I've seen this happen over and over and over again. So I feel like making it as digestible as possible is still not leading to much. Also, citizen science, as Maya's bringing up, we've done a lot of it. There's some really cool work going on in the region on it right now. But same thing. I mean, I've worked with citizens where they do citizen science, and then you go to, you know that the water is contaminated that they're testing. And, you know, when we go to get the results, they tell us, no, it's not polluted at all. And we're like, but all of your neighbors are polluted, and you know, it's very obviously contaminated from our like validation that we're doing with experts. And we find out that perhaps one of the reasons they're doing that is because the municipality or some political figure is telling them it's not contaminated. And so they prefer to just align with some, you know, worldview than the evidence that they are themselves doing through, you know, deep training in citizen science. So there's like all of these oddities going on, and we were hearing about, are we in an ecosystem of evidence? I think this is a fantastic question, and I'm not sure if you were asking it in the sense of, is it evidence that takes priority, you know, or what is actually going on when we're talking with policymakers in a hyper-sectarian, post-conflict, traumatized, I don't know what society that we find ourselves in. And I'll ask a very quick second question. Antoine, the bad cop, is looking at me. That's very quick, which is patience versus urgency. I mean, these are super urgent issues, and we're talking about generations of evidence gathering in the West that I think we won't be able to catch up to. I mean, what do we do about that? How do we confront that reality of needing to deal with these issues urgently, you know, because people are dying, and you know, the amount of time it would take to have evidence that then, you know, allows us to deal with it in a responsible way, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sammy. Sorry, I couldn't recognize you from this distance. I'd suggest if we have additional questions, let's take 2 more right now, and then we'll do a round of everybody answering what they want to answer.
Yes, so to start off with, I'd like to thank everyone here for gathering all these ideas together, and you know, and appreciate the time of the panel. So what I really liked about this whole topic is how you were combining the aspects of the importance of science and evidence, but also how are the people going to take it, and how do we give out this story so that people would know, would be aware of what is going on, even though, I thought someone was saying something. Oh, no worries. So the question I had was, it was something interesting that Dr. Fadi said earlier, where we do have the evidence. It's quite striking, but sometimes, and this is why we don't need to do the science again, but wouldn't there be cases, and if so, how would it be a proper way to do it, to make more, what's the word I'm looking for? When you conduct science, you do multiple sets of the same experiment over and over again so that you can get a better statistic and therefore better evidence. What would be a good way to do that when it comes to citizen science or something of that type?
Thanks a lot. And then, okay, we've got, we'll quickly take these 2 more, but very, very quick, please.
Thank you. Tony Bazzi from the Faculty of Medicine. Dr. Jardali, I thank you for your concrete words about Marasim Tatbi'i and about the laws being there. But even if you have the Marasim Tatbi'i, you need somebody to execute. So what moves people? What makes people execute, even on the evidence that's here? What makes people execute is accountability. And accountability is only in democratic states. And that's why I'm very optimistic with the European Union, now pardon my naivety, how they move very positively with the issue of plastics. Compare this to our cafeteria at the medical center, where hundreds of employees and students are being fed in plastic containers since 2021. And these plastic containers go straight forward to the Mediterranean landfill. And maybe some of them were burnt recently in the Burj Hammoud. multiple queries and requests and pleas, and nobody answers because there's no accountability. So I'm pleading with you now to move on that if you can. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then we have one last question up here.
Thank you. My question will be more about initiatives and collaboration. Are there any initiatives or collaboration you are implementing at the school level to prepare students to cultivate their mindset through the lens of education for sustainable development? Thank you.
Thank you all so much. So we're going to start with Dr. Fadi, who I saw writing very quickly. So feel free to tackle any or all of those.
Yeah. So let me start by the I think the first question when it comes to yes, it's always frustrating, and we have been really in this business for many years now. It has been always frustrating that we do a lot of work. You work at the research, you put a policy brief, you get it out, you engage the media, and it hype for 1 or 2 days, and then, as you said, you get thanks but like thank you but not thank you type of thing, meaning nothing happened. So, and I think what we have learned is that we need to follow through. This is just one among different multifaceted interventions that we have to do to get the message out. And what I mean by that, are we changing the policy narrative on a particular topic? Let me give you an example. And this is a recent example because, so 2 years ago, we have produced something on sin taxation. This is about putting tax on alcohol and tobacco and try to earmark it to health. قامت الدنيا وقعد قالوا لنا إنه this is nothing in Lebanon allow you for earmarking taxes to public goods. And قالوا okay. قالوا لنا الوضع the situation is really bad, the economy you cannot really put taxes, etc., etc. We knew that it was not feasible at that time, but this is just one hit on the nail. So you can start really working on changing the current narrative about how we think about health system reform. Currently now, after 2 or 3 years, if you look at the draft law, universal healthcare coverage. Why? Because we engage all parliamentarians. We told them, okay, in your electoral platform, you promise for universal healthcare coverage. Let me tell you how other countries financed universal healthcare coverage. One important part of financing universal coverage was through sin taxation. Look at even look in the countries around us, you will see that they actually try to earmark on this. So what I mean by that sometimes you need to have perseverance and determination. It's not a hit and run thing. Engaging with policymakers, influencing the policy mainstream or narrative requires concerted efforts, engagement at different level up until it will be picked up. That's how policy works. So it requires a little bit more of energy and perseverance. The one thing, I think the other question that was mentioned about the ecosystem, yes, no, we're not yet there. To be honest with you, now with the Parliamentary Health Committee that is working on the draft law for universal healthcare coverage, I'm talking about this because this is happening as we speak. They, in fact, working with consultancy company to actually do actuarial studies. And the actuarial studies had a major problem because in Lebanon, we don't have up-to-date data on utilization, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a lot of gaps in this. Now, if they come to the university, what are we going to tell them? We're going to tell them, look, we cannot do that because there's no perfect data. But consultancy firms are working with that, and they are providing answer to them, although it's actually imperfect answers. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to come together as an ecosystem. When I say ecosystem, we're not only talking about academicians, we're talking about the different entities that have one way or a role in terms of bringing evidence. Are we coming all together and bringing consolidated evidence that is so powerful and so systematic that can be actually used? This is not actually al-qita. This is what I'm trying to say. I think the last point I want to mention, I agree with you, Dr. It's one of the things that we absolutely, Marasin Tatbiqi is very important guidelines for action, but we need to do a lot more of monitoring and evaluation of the implementation or the lack of implementation of those entities, and also linking it to political accountability. We have a huge issues in Lebanon, as we all know, with the political accountability. We have been having dysfunctional government, cabinet, dysfunctional parliament for many years, despite if we look at all the political rhetoric and the promises that provided in the parliamentary election and after. In fact, zero in terms of really effective implementation and benefit to the society. The question, this is what activism is. This is what really advocacy is. But we need also to do policy advocacy based on evidence, not policy advocacy because I don't like this political party or not. Policy advocacy to actually say this is the type of implementation that should have happened. This is the barrier for that implementation. This is why we are worse off now, but linking also to political system and the political landscape. This is where interdisciplinary work should happen among different entities and faculties at UB and beyond, because we need to get exactly to this. The bottom line is that if we have accountable policy and accountable political system, we will definitely be able at a better, I would say, stage of making sure that really policies are actually bringing benefit to people, which is really not happening. But more need to be done on that. I agree with you. The last point that was mentioned, if you allow me, on schools, if I understand very well, you mentioned about really, I know there's many schools that are actually now educating, kids and children on the Sustainable Development Goal, what their role is. And I think we need to actually make it in the mainstream thinking of how people really, even when they are really at the high school or less, they have to actually start thinking about public good, complex problem, how they can think differently. The problem with education system in Lebanon that we inject a lot of facts and knowledge in people's mind, but we don't educate them how to think, how to approach, how to solve a problem. And this is what we need to actually have more and more. We at EUB trying now more and more in our education program to actually, let them think about the bigger picture, the system thinking approach, how to approach problem. We don't give you answers, but we actually show you how to approach a problem and provide a solution that can be workable in the current context. Sorry, I talked.
No, very well done. You covered a lot of questions. Dana, Christine, do you have anything you want to end on? It's okay if not. Okay, then we'll end there. Sorry to have not given more time to the Q&A. I hope the other panelists will forgive me for saying this, but I think we're all on LinkedIn. Certainly, if anybody wants to send a message and discuss further, welcome it. Yeah, thanks so much for attending, and thanks again to AUB.
Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. This was, I think the conversation could go on for hours. I myself had dozens of questions as well. The good thing is that we'd like to invite you all to a coffee reception now with the speakers. We'll have a few minutes to exchange. We'll have some time to continue the conversation. And one other thing, so as I mentioned before, this roundtable is the third of the series, The New Roadmap to a Green Transition, Exploring Today's Climate Actors. The closing forum for the series will take place on November 28th here at the UB as well. The theme will be Critical Perspectives on Inter-Mediterranean Climate Cooperation. So it'll be a forum from 9 till 2 p.m. And please mark the date from now. We hope to see you all there. And once again, thank you so much for the panelists. And please, let's continue the conversation right outside. Thank you all.